Romantic literature. In Germany, during the 1760s and 1770s and 80s, there was a movement called Sturm und Drang, translated as Storm and Drive, a group of poets who opposed what they considered the imposition of one way of thinking, the rational way of thinking. And they emphasized more the world of feelings, the world of emotions, the connection with nature and the past. Right after the Sturm und Drang movement, two extraordinary poets, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Friedrich Schiller, represented in this monument in Weimar, Germany, where they had a long friendship and they created some of the most representative works of the Romantic period. Goethe, in this monument in Italy, in Villa Borghese, is very well known because basically two works among many others. The Faustus, which is the story of a man who sells his life to the devil in order to remain attractive, handsome, and healthy. And the Letters of the Young Werther, a poet who writes to his beloved Carlotta and ends up committing suicide. It's a beautiful defense of the right of someone to end his or her own life based on the pain caused by love, disappointment, or by life in general. A very controversial work indeed, but that underlines the centrality of sentiments, of feelings in our own lives. In England, two major poets, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth, started what is called the English Romantic movement. Coleridge, who was born in 1772 and lived until 1834, is well known because of poems like Kubla Khan or The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, with an example of iambic feet, as I will read. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner says in two of its stanzas, "And now the storm blast came, and he was tyrannous and strong. He struck with his overtaking wings, and chased us south along, with sloping mast and dripping prow, as who pursued with yell and blow. Still treats the shadow of his foe, and forward bends his head. The ship drove fast, loud roared the blast, and southward aye we fled." Iambic because, and now the storm blast came, and he was tyrannous and strong. The iambic foot is ta-tan, 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 a unit of two syllables, the second of which is stressed. So Coleridge in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner was a master of classical forms of musicality. Poetry was conceived as an expression that had to be in connection with the harmony of the world, the rhythm of nature. There was no disconnection between the individual and the world, despite the fact that the centrality of the themes was the subjective world of the poet or a character. William Wordsworth, his good friend, very well known for poems like The Prelude and the autobiographical writings, was also considered one of the important founders, the main founders of English Romanticism. Not long later came the second generation, Lord Byron, who died very young, only at the age of 36, fighting in Greece. He's well known for poems like Don Juan and Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and short lyrics like She Walks in Beauty. He incarnated the ideal of bringing poetry to life. A poet for Byron was not just someone who sat down and wrote. It had to be someone who enacted a poetic way of living, which is pretty much what we still understand in many ways in modern poetry. Most of our contemporary poetic production in the Western world derives from Romanticism, from writers like Byron or Coleridge or Wordsworth. And some of the generational partners of Byron, like John Keats and his famous Odes, Percy Shelley, who also lived between the late 18th century and the early 19th century, they all died young. Curiously, Byron died in 1824, Keats died in 1821, Shelley died in 1822. And he's well known for some of his classical poems like Ozymandias or the Ode to the West Wind, Music, When Soft Voices Die, and so on. But mostly for Prometheus Unbound, widely considered to be his most important work. He married a woman, Mary Shelley, who is well known, well remembered today for this character, Frankenstein, the monster created by a mad scientist, the Baron von Frankenstein, a novel that was very successful, published for the first time in 1818. Frankenstein is the other side of Romanticism, the Gothic side, the side that has to do with obscure forces, the side that has to do with vampires. And all this set of characters that are now very popular in TV series, they were already in the imagination of romantic poets and writers like Mary Shelley. The other side of the self. We're not just reason and good emotions. We also have something monstrous underneath our skin. And that is something that was of great interest to romantic poets and romantic writers in general. In relation to the past, Sir Walter Scott, important fiction writer who is very well known by his novels of historical character, mainly Ivanhoe. Ivanhoe is the character that represents the incarnation of chivalry and nobility, a representation in the 19th century of the medieval moment in which England became one of the most important kingdoms of the old world. And a representation of Ivanhoe by John Langford Preacher, a well-known actor in the 19th century, with all his coat of arms and his armor. On the side of the French writers, Romanticism also was central to the production of those times. Victor Hugo, who was the author of a very well-known work, Les Miserables, which has a musical and even a movie. He was a national hero because of his representation of the pain of the popular classes in the 19th century France. Théophile Gautier, an important poet who also represented the values of French Romanticism. Alexander Dumas. There were two Alexander Dumas, the father, who we have here, and the son. But the father is well known, remember, because of his adventure novels like The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo that have had many adaptations in film and plays all over the world. Here's just one example of a Hollywood version of The Three Musketeers represented by modern actors, but with the well-known anecdote of these three soldiers of the French court that were joined by D'Artagnan, a fourth one, under the motto, one for all for one, representing the ideals of solidarity and chivalry in the 17th century, but written in the 19th. Then Henry Wordsworth Longfellow, an American poet, important representative of the American Romanticism in epic poems like Evangeline and the Song of Hiawatha that already are considered American classics. Romanticism also takes place in the United States in the mid-19th century with Walt Whitman and his leaves of Grass, the wonderful compilation of his work that is expansive. It doesn't follow the rules of typical poetry. He tends to use more the free verse and the blank verse, and a kind of expression that emphasizes the expansion of the self, typical of the romantic conception of the world. But at the same time, the side of mystery, obscurity, darkness was explored by Edgar Allan Poe, now considered a national classic of American letters, particularly with his well-known poem, The Raven. Again, on the French side, we have to go back to the 1850s and 60s, together with Romanticism, with Victor Hugo and Théophile Gautier. A few decades later, in the 1840s and 50s, a group of poets started to explore other sides of the human mind. Why does poetry have to be about beautiful things? Why can't it be about ugly things, about repulsive things? Isn't that part of human experience too? Isn't that worth of being an object of poetry? Charles Baudelaire, the extraordinary poet we have here, was not well received at his time. His Fleurs du Mal, the flowers of evil, the title of his work, was controversial. He talked about drugs, about prostitutes, about the low life of Paris. How could that be poetry? Well, he challenged that conception, that poetry should be only about beautiful things and noble things. Poetry could be about everything, he declared. And his poetry is the proof of that conception. There's a different kind of beauty in any case. The beauty of what is twisted, the beauty of what is evil, the beauty of what is not necessarily brilliant or conventional. So this gave birth to a different conception of artistic work, together with the two books by Arthur Rimbaud, another contemporary of Baudelaire, who only wrote the Illuminations and A Season in Hell when he was between 19 and 21 years old, a real genius of modern poetry. Rimbaud retired to have a life as a merchant of arms in Africa, never published anything again, but with those two fundamental books, he revolutionized poetry in the Western world, with his friend and lover, Paul Verlaine. These are the so-called poètes maudits, the damned poets, poets that are not pleasant anymore, poets that oppose modernity. At the same time, and this is paradoxical, they were the most modern poets of their own century.